Okay, so what we're going to be going over today is immigration. So we've talked about farmers, we've talked about things in the western territories, we've talked about labor around cities, but now we're going to talk about who's coming into the country at this time. So we're still in Unit 4 and 5, Lecture 5. We're going to be going over questions 17 through 22 in Unit 4, and then we're going to skip ahead to question number 11 in Unit 5. But I'll let you know when that's coming. So we're going to try to keep this shorter. I know they've been running a little long. So East Coast, so that's where we're going to start. So people coming into the country through the East Coast. The thing to remember here is Ellis Island, a very important place to remember in U.S. history. This is where a large amount of immigrants came to this country around the 1880s and from there. So it's a small island outside New York City, and basically where people were admitted to the country. They were either said, yes, you can come in, or no, you are not allowed to come in. And there were people who were denied. That's something to remember. For health reason or for other purposes, were denied access and sent back to their country of origin. So who is coming and from where? So we're working on question 18 now. So the thing to remember here is we're looking at Southern and Eastern Europe. So this is where a large amount of Italians came in during the 1880s and so on. So that's sort of dealing with Southern Europe. And then Eastern Europe, there's a large Jewish population coming into the country from Eastern Europe. So they were fleeing religious persecution at this time. So that's the two places to remember is Eastern and Southern Europe are the big groups coming to the country at this time. So what was life like for them? So we're looking at question number 20 now. So the thing to remember is this term of tenement houses. So I'll talk about that more later, so tenement houses were these places where new immigrants would live, and they're generally very, very small housing. So this one is a picture of a tenement, or one room in a tenement building. So there's 5 children in this picture and 2 adults, and this is their entire apartment or house. So it's one room, that's their kitchen on the left, closet, bedroom, everything's all mixed together into one thing, and they're living very tightly, and there's people right next to them, right on top of them, right below them, everywhere. So they're packed really tightly. So as you can see from the past picture, this is sort of a made-up picture. These people were not made up, but it was sort of set up. These people were obviously trying to look nice for their picture. You have the boy over there on the left in his tie, and everyone's sort of looking at the camera and paying attention and showing sort of their best look for their house. This one, though, is probably what a lot of these tenement houses actually look like. So you have a lot of people living right on top of each other, and not the nicest conditions. Stuff hanging from the ceiling, sort of dirty. So the thing to remember also at this time is poverty. So a lot of these new immigrants were living in a pretty high degree of poverty. So they were trying to survive the best way they could, working whatever jobs they could find, and they were just trying to survive. So it was not an easy life for new immigrants during the 1880s and so on. In this final picture, this is a picture of outside the tenement buildings. So this would be like they're basically like laundry room, but really it was just clotheslines run from one side of the building to the next. Just trying to dry out their stuff as much as possible and try to stay as clean as possible, even though it was incredibly hard to do that in these times. So going back, so settlement houses. So we have tenement houses, that's where they lived. Settlement houses are places where immigrants can go to get help. So the most famous one of these was the Hull House in Chicago, and the idea behind them is to provide educational and social opportunities. So a place for them to go to, number one, learn the language would be a great thing to know in the U.S., and then also to sort of get acclimated to how people not carry themselves, but how people deal with things in the U.S., so that social aspect, knowing where to go to find things, how to get help, things of that nature. So the idea was really trying to help immigrants and working class people acclimate to the U.S., and as I said, the Hull House in Chicago is the most famous one to remember and would be a great thing to know for the test. So Tammany Hall, moving on, so we talked about sort of how they're living. Tammany Hall is more about politics. So Tammany Hall was run by this guy named Boss Tweed, and he had this thing called the Tweed Ring, which is basically he was offering patronage to new immigrants. So that's an important term to know. So patronage is the idea of trading goods or jobs or coal or rent or things like that for votes. So basically he would give them what they needed to survive, which was a big deal for immigrants, and they would give him their votes in return. So trying to sort of get control of politics by using these new immigrants, mainly Irish, and taking their votes and then sort of embezzling money from the government. So using immigrants for their own personal gains. So it was a really big deal. Embezzled a lot of money from New York City and the federal government, and eventually it was caught and he was punished very severely. So we've talked about East Coast things going on with immigrants in the East Coast. Now we're going to move all the way to the West Coast. So they're at Ellis Island. So number 22 here. So their Ellis Island is called Angel Island, and it's pictured there to the right. It's in the San Francisco Bay, and the idea behind it was this is where a large amount of Chinese immigrants came into the country. So there was the Ellis Island in the east, but that doesn't mean that everyone during this time came in through this one sort of portal of entry. Angel Island was also a big stopping point for new immigrants coming from other areas of the world. So it's an important thing to remember that not everyone came through the East Coast. There are people coming in from other avenues to the U.S. So, impressions of immigration. So the guy to remember here, so we're working on question 21, is Horatio Alger. So he wrote these things called dime novels, which were exactly what they sound like. They were novels that were a dime. They were fictional. So a lot of his stories dealt with young men, and they dealt with sort of how they worked their way up. They showed responsibility, honesty, all the true values that supposedly Americans believe in, and they went from rags to riches. So that would be one of the main themes to remember for Horatio Alger, was rags to riches. And the influence here was it gave young immigrants hope. So that was a big one, but it also sort of gave them, in a sense, false hope, because it's incredibly hard to go from rags to riches. So to go from a poor wage worker living in a tenement house to even middle class with some security where you don't have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from. So it's a worthwhile dream. But sometimes he made it a little seem too easy. So it's important to note that all these things didn't happen. So were we really a melting pot? So a lot of people use this term when they talk about the U.S. and immigration, how immigrants coming to this country were part of a melting pot. They became part of the U.S. melting pot, and that's what this cartoon on the right's about. You have Lady Liberty there stirring up all these immigrants sort of into one sort of blend. So it's a theory about how immigrants were sort of treated and sort of were in the U.S., sort of how they all mixed together and things like that. But the thing is, it might not actually be true. So if you've ever been to a church with stained glass windows or sort of the fragmented windows, the idea, another theory is that we actually are closer to that, because these people weren't sort of mixing all together and just mixing up and all these cultures were just coming together. It was more like they were keeping their culture, living together, and staying separate from each other. They're in the same country, but they're not really mixing together. They're staying within they're staying with their own kind in a sense. So here's a picture of Brooklyn, and this sort of shows you more visually what I'm talking about. So the different colors would represent where the majority of people in those areas came from, their country of origin. So as you can see, it's sort of broken up, like I was talking about that stained glass window. So there's sort of broken up throughout there, and they're living with people who are like them, because people like to live with people who are like them, who have the same values, were raised the same way, and just have similar interests. So it's still a form of segregation, so people are living together, but it's sort of natural segregation in that people in this time were trying to find security as well, so trying to stay safe, and they felt they were more safe with people coming from the same place they were. So that's all for today, and I'll try to keep it short for you.